Welcome to part 2 of Chapter 9, Issues in Adolescent Health. We will look at adolescent health, including looking at sleep, talk just very briefly about substance use and abuse, and then we will look at a couple of eating disorders. Beginning with adolescent health, this is an important time in life to set up good habits. It is in adolescence that we tend to kind of begin our adult habits. In adolescence and emerging adulthood, the habits that we start in those time periods are ones that we often continue throughout our adulthood, or at least much of our adulthood. So these behaviors begin in adolescence, and what we're not thinking of at that time is that, bad health habits are going to affect our later incident rates of things like heart disease and diabetes and cancer, and other long-term chronic issues that build up over years. So this is considered a critical juncture by many experts as a time to set up good habits. You can see that 21% of adolescents are overweight in the U.S. This is up from about 11% if you go back to the early 1990s. So it is an ongoing concern in the U.S. that we are becoming heavier. We have more and more overweight children, adolescents, and adults. So we went up from 11% to 21% of adolescents, since the early 1990s. Part of the reason, as mentioned here, decreased intake of fruit and vegetables, less exercise, higher sedentary activity. We sit in front of screens all the time. We have time-saving devices. I mean, we're just generally less active, and we don't eat as well. Okay. Sleep patterns. Actually, before I get to the sleep, I'm going to just do it in the other order and start with the bottom of the screen and the leading causes of death. And this is just a quick list. These are the top 3 leading causes of death in adolescence. Number 1 is unintentional injuries. Mainly, these are car accidents, including DUI accidents. I can tell you about 50% of motor vehicle fatalities involving adolescents are in DUI situations. 50% of them, so half of the adolescent deaths are from DUI situations. So I mean, it is an ongoing problem and issue for adolescents. We can think back to the previous lecture, and I talked about risk-taking behavior in adolescence. The fact that the prefrontal cortex is not mature yet. This is one of the results. Is that we may take more risks as far as drinking and driving, as well as driving while texting or talking on the phone. Okay, so this is obviously still a major problem. Is the number of motor vehicle fatalities in adolescence. Homicide is number 2, and suicide is number 3. The suicide rate has tripled if you go back to that since the 1950s. So over the last 50 plus years, the suicide rate among adolescents has tripled, and I'm not sure exactly what we would attribute this to, but perhaps things such as a more stressful lifestyle may be part of the reason for the increased suicide rate. Okay, sleep patterns. Only 27% of U.S. adolescents sleep 8 or more hours per night. The current suggestion is 9 hours per night as to be perfectly healthy. And so we only have about a quarter of adolescents even getting 8 hours of sleep per night. In experiments, when given the opportunity to sleep, until they're completely rested. I mean, in these studies, they set adolescents or whatever subjects they have up, they set them up in sleep labs in dark conditions with no clocks, no alarms, no engagements that they need to get up for at any time. So like they test, how long will you sleep when there's no reason that you have to get up. There's no clock telling you to get up, and if you're in dark conditions. And what they find in these studies is that adolescents, given the opportunity, will sleep an average of 9 hours and 25 minutes per night on average. So basically 9.5 hours is when an adolescent will sleep. And what these studies are suggesting is that that's what the body wants. I mean, that's how long you'll sleep before you feel completely rested and want to get up. So this is one of the studies that led to them suggesting that adolescents really should be getting, a minimum of 9 hours per night. Obviously, as you can see in this statistic, we're not doing that. Only a quarter of our adolescents get 8 hours. Okay. Inconsistent sleep patterns are associated with a number of negatives. You can see a list here, a small list here: inattention, emotional and peer-related problems, as well as anxiety and higher levels of suicide ideation, which just means thinking about suicide. When we look at the chart on this next page, this is looking at percents of students who get 8 hours of sleep or more on an average school night. And you can see that the numbers decrease as you move from 9th up to 12th grade. One thing that can partially account for the older adolescents getting less sleep is melatonin release times. This is kind of an interesting biological thing that a lot of people don't realize. Is that you may have heard of melatonin. It is a sleep-inducing hormone that gets released by the brain during the evening, and it's what causes you to get drowsy and feel like going to sleep. And for younger adolescents, in one study, they found that this was being released on average around 9:30 p.m. at night. And this would cause the younger adolescents to get drowsy and go to sleep. Whereas for older adolescents in the study, they found that on average it was at 10:30 p.m. that the melatonin was being released. So one of the reasons that older adolescents tend to stay up later and therefore get less sleep is that they're not getting tired as early as younger adolescents. They're biologically more alert and staying awake longer because of the later melatonin release. And in fact, there's been some studies even suggesting that it may be much later than 10:30. And I was reading something. I was reading one study that was finding some adolescent subjects not releasing melatonin until midnight or 1 a.m. in the morning, because they were staying up with screen activity or playing video games or things like that kept the brain alert and kind of delayed the melatonin release. So anyways, there is a biological reason why older adolescents, like the ones pictured in the 11th and 12th grades here, are less likely to get a full sleep, is that they're not as tired in the evenings. Okay. Substance use and abuse. I'm only covering this with this one slide, and you can read more about it in the book. We have one of the highest rates of adolescent drug use in the world. Adolescent illicit drug, alcohol, and cigarette use has declined in recent years. What has gone up is specifically marijuana use has obviously increased with some of the new legislation in various states, legalizing and selling marijuana. The other thing that's increased is pill use. There's an increased a percentage of adolescents that do use pills for recreational use. But the good things are the declines of cigarette, alcohol, and other illicit drugs I didn't mention have also declined. Parents, peers, and education, all important in prevention of drugs. And that's all I'm going to do. Once again, read the book on this concerning this section. Our last topic in part 2 is eating disorders. And we'll just look at 2 of them here, the 2 major ones. First being anorexia nervosa. This is the relentless pursuit of thinness through starvation. So the anorexic basically just starves himself over time in order to try to get thinner and thinner. It typically begins in the early to mid adolescent years. So this is something that is associated with going through puberty, which is why we get the early to mid adolescence time frame. Their bodies change. Many adolescent females do not like it, as I was suggesting in the last video. The theory is that anorexia is linked to pressure from images in media and social media. That is, we are bombarded as a society with images of thin females as being the standard of beauty. Our models tend to be impossibly thin. We have photoshopping constantly going on of bodies that appear in online in different websites or in magazines, and it's just it's just a relentless presentation of thinness as being the ideal, and when this kind of gets drummed into your heads and you start seeing this as a child and into adolescence, it is one of the things that can lead to this kind of anxious type of disorder. As far as defining anorexia, they need to have a weight less than 85% of what is considered normal for the person's age and height. They have an intense fear of gaining weight. It does not decrease with weight loss. Even as they lose weight, they don't feel any less compelled to lose weight. They do not feel better about their bodies. It is based on a distorted body image, and so there is no final weight or final look that will be satisfying to them. Their body, even when they are skin and bones, and they still will find something that's not right about their body, and that they will continue to starve themselves. Obviously, this is a very, very serious mental disorder. These anorexics always see themselves as too fat, no matter what their weight is, and the starvation can and does in many cases kill them. One common characteristic is amenorrhea. This refers to delayed menarche, that is delayed first menstruation, or a pause in menstruation. Remember, when I talked about menarche, when menstruation begins for females, I mentioned earlier about athletes that were very thin and had low percent of body weight that they would put off beginning their menstruation, and such as gymnasts and swimmers. So the same is certainly true of anorexics. Because of their extreme low percent of body weight, the body reacts by delaying the onset of menstruation, and it's like once again the body being signaled, in a sense, is sending signals to the brain that it is not ready to become reproductive, to care for an offspring. Anorexia does have, I've been talking about females mainly because it's, as it says here, 10 times more likely in females, but be aware it certainly does happen in males as well. It's just as serious when it does happen. Let me just kind of outline the typical if we can say there's a typical anorexic, these are, based on studies, these are the main characteristics we expect. They're very competitive. They tend to be very high achieving. They're stressed about being the best at everything. This is not just about their bodies and losing weight. They have an overall competitive, high achieving personality, wanting to be the best at everything. They tend to come from an educated, middle income family. So this is actually affecting middle or high SES more so than low SES or poverty adolescents. I mean, it is coming from the pressures associated with being brought up in a middle or high SES family, that when parents have high expectations for the child. These are anorexics. Anorexics are typically non-Latino white adolescents or young adults. So this is a disorder that is affecting middle SES white adolescent females mainly, that are high achieving, wanting to be the best at everything. Okay. Bulimia is the next one I'm going to talk about. In this case, the individual consistently follows a binge and purge pattern to be diagnosed as a bulimic. This needs to occur at least 2 times per week over a period of 3 months or longer. So at least twice a week over a period of 3 months or longer. So it's not you're not considered bulimic if you do this for a week or two. I mean, there needs to be some consistency where it's become a standard pattern for them. The binge and purge. When we think about binge and purge, what comes to mind for most people is that the person overeats and then they go and vomit. But that is just one form of purging. Purging can take many different forms. So purging just means that you're doing something to try to get rid of the extra calories that you've ingested. So vomiting is the most common. Using laxatives is another common method. The purge could take the form of excessive exercise. So some people will binge and then just exercise for hours to burn off the calories. That's also considered a purge. Some use starvation as a purge. So they will binge and then starve themselves over a period of days. So purging can take many forms. It does not just refer to throwing up and vomiting. Here are some characteristics of bulimics. They're preoccupied with food, which leads to the binging behavior. They have an intense fear of becoming overweight, very similar to the anorexics in that way. But they don't have the same kind of relentless pursuit of thinness. I mean, they just don't. They're very concerned about their weight. They weigh themselves a lot. They're depressed or anxious. They have a distorted body image. That's just very similar to anorexia. Both cases, it kind of revolves around this distorted body image that they hold in their minds. But one of the major differences, though, is that the bulimic is going to fall within a normal weight range. So they are harder to detect than anorexics. I mean, bulimic can go a lot longer with this disorder without people necessarily noticing them. They tend to be very secretive about their behaviors, and they hide their purging behaviors from others. The anorexic will always be discovered at some point because of their extreme thinness that they will reach, and people, you can see the result of their anorexia. The bulimic can, in some cases, bulimics go years without being, in a sense, discovered by others or others noticing that they have a problem. And there are bulimics that do live with it for years in a secretive fashion. Okay, and that finishes section 2 of chapter 9.